love, affection, how would you feel if you had no love? How would you feel if you were completely alone and abandoned in times where you would wish to celebrate? But we all do have someone, even if at times we feel like we are alone. To love the Lord your God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. So, the theme of this lesson is looking at Deuteronomy, which Moses is basically a book of him presenting to Israel right before they enter the promised land. And here we're talking about love, and specifically to love God. And so it's an interesting question. Why should we love God? And I want to kind of start with that as the question, because it's not something that, at least in modern days, we don't even question. I mean, of course we should love God. But there's also this divisiveness because there is a lot more atheism, there's a lot more focus on evolution, on logic, and to love God means that we almost in a way have to accept what people point out as like all this bad that comes into play in the world. That if God is this loving being that we should love, then why are we suffering with all of COVID, with all these problems? Why should we love God? And to me, it's very interesting. The lesson talks about various things relating to how we should follow God. And as I was reading that, because it creates a lot of emphasis on keeping God's commandments and showing that side of if we love him, we should keep his commandments, which, yes, if we love someone, we want to please them. We want to make sure that they're happy, right? And so if we love God, we want to keep his commandments. But it goes deeper. So that's what I wanted to kind of look at and focus on this other side. Why should we love God? And on top of that, there's this other question that I'll bring up a bit later. But I wanted to start with this quote because it shows almost how intense it is that we should love God. Basically, here it goes. So, love the Lord your God with all your heart. How interesting that here in the midst of the law, in the midst of all the warnings, rules, and provisions, the people are called to love God, and not just to love him, but to do so with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, which points to the absolute nature of this love, which is interesting. It's basically like completely giving your all entirely to this love, right? How is this going to change you? Why should we do this? And I was thinking about that specifically because it's a lot to ask. Imagine if anyone demanded that from you, how would you feel, right? And the reason for this, and the reason why the lesson brings this up, and the reason why I want to bring this up, is because we only know things from our level, from our point of view and our understanding. And the lesson touches on something that I think is really, really nice. Basically, they touch on the fact that God is just beyond like our comprehension in so many levels. That when we see the levels that God is, we can't understand it. It's just too much for our lives, for our existence to comprehend. And the reason for that is just what the lesson talks about is how God gave it all to die for us. How not only that, he created us, he loved us before we existed, after the extent that God went to prove himself. It starts kind of contradicting, but this thread of that love is to make sure that we have that choice to love God, right? It's asked, but it's not forced. And when we read a lot of times the Bible, it feels like it might seem like it's forced, especially when reading the Old Testament, because of the language or the type of passion, because it's a promise, it's a covenant that God is creating, which we talked on last lesson. But what this means, right? God is basically wanting to protect us. Why? Because our lives, right? If we can only understand the level that we're at, how are we going to be able to comprehend God? How are we going to be able to understand the complexities ahead of us? The same way when God brought them to this promised land, their limited capabilities, their own reality and understanding, they said, this is impossible, and wanted to leave. Now here they are the second time, having to do the impossible in their own minds, because they have to basically, with everything telling them that it won't work out, have to trust that God knows what's best. And spoiler alert, they get in, and they take over the land, and they become a powerful nation. But here is that moment before. It's very easy to look at history and say, oh yeah, they did all these great things. Look how amazing it is. But for you to be in that situation, it's a lot harder to be in those shoes and make the same decisions. And so Israel, and a lot of times people in the Bible make these mistakes. And that's why God is almost trying really hard. He's almost begging, please, follow this, because he loves us, because he did it first. And the lesson touches on that, because he first loved us, right? We have this example of everything God did for us. And if we give all of this trust, all of this love to God, and that's why a lot of times it's compared to the love that we have with a mother or a father, because when we see even animals, how the mother will protect her young, right? Everything that is done to protect, even giving up their lives. How our own mothers do that. How a lot of times I see my own mother, the extent that she goes to protect, to make sure that I'm not suffering. I mean, I'm an adult, right? And still she's there caring and worrying with me. And it's this strange feeling for me, because I don't want her to suffer, but it also just creates this warmth, right? This little glimpse of what God is doing for us. And how can I not love my mother, not want to see her happy, and want to do everything I can, right? So for God, it's even more. But there's this interesting thing, and this is what I wanted to touch on, that kind of the lesson brings up in Monday, basically, which is talking about us fearing God. Because the word fear, right, kind of means being scared. It's what we see as a definition of fear. And so is it saying for us to be afraid of God? How can we love God and be afraid of God? There's this contradiction. But that's what's interesting. So like I said, we can't understand God. We'll never be able to understand God and his infinite wisdom and knowledge, because, for us to even exist in this world, for things to just work, it's amazing how we mess up things when we try to take over, right, and try to bend things to our will. How is it that it works so well? It's because God is just, with all of his knowledge, putting in all this detail, all this understanding to make things just work together. We can't understand that. So when we try to understand God, and when we see glimpses of God, we're struck with this reverence and awe, just with amazement, that if we look at the definition, or the word fear God, right? The word fear is more like an emotion, because how would you be able to put things into words if you were seeing all of this knowledge, all of this, even as a prophet, maybe seeing the future or the past and understanding things? That sort of fear, Moses having a glimpse of God, just a little bit of his power. And Israel, basically when that happened to Moses, they couldn't even stare at the face of Moses. That's a glimpse of God's majesty, of his glory, right? So yeah, that word fear is because there's so much behind God that we can't comprehend it. So here it is, right? Fearing God and loving him, because this power, right? This being who did all of this for us, yet that's the amount of power that he could have done anything to us. We're nothing. We're specks when we get towards God. And so that's the fear, right? That's the reverence. That's the sort of understanding that we get towards God. And even then, this is what I think is the amazing connection. Even then, he's not forcing us. We still make the choice. So when God is saying to love him, it's more of that conditional. It's if you love me, you will have these benefits, because, of course, if a mother tells a child, my sister, she has a son, my nephew, every time I see him, he might be wanting to do something, run around like crazy in the house, and sometimes he'll fall and hurt himself. And my sister really wants him not to do that, and it's because he's going to get hurt. because he's so young. He's 2 going on 3, and he doesn't have that kind of balance. He doesn't understand a lot of times the danger that is lurking just inches away sometimes, like an outlet plug, right? She understands. We don't understand those dangers as well. God does, and he sees us inches away from those sorts of dangers and wants to protect us. And that's why he wants us to love him, to trust him, to have that relational. Because if we love him, that means we are trusting him, and we know, we are for sure convinced that he knows what's best for us and that we're giving that trust to him. But if we don't love God, we're going to doubt. We're going to suspect and do our own thing and not have that protection. So here the lesson is showing that. And that's what I wanted you guys to think about as you study the lesson. Think about those 2 things, why to love God and that fear that God instills. But I wanted that question again, basically to be answered by Friday's Further Thoughts question. I didn't put the whole quote here, but you should read it for yourself. There's so much more. But this is already quite a bit, but it's very interesting. So look at this. The cross of Christ will be the science and the song of the redeemed through all eternity. In Christ glorified, they will behold Christ crucified. Never will it be forgotten that he whose power created and upheld the unnumbered worlds through the vast realms of space, the beloved of God, the majesty of heaven, he whom cherubs and shining seraph delighted to adore, humbled himself to uplift the fallen man, that he bore the guilt and shame of sin and the hiding of his Father's face, till the woes of a lost world broke his heart and crushed out his life on Calvary's cross. And there's more to the quote. But basically, everything that God did, everything to give us that glimpse of love. And he's asking for that love back, not because he's trying to be controlling, but because he knows that he understands what's best. So how are you going to respond to that request of love? For the example of everything that he did, are you going to love him back?